Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to follow up. I think it was a good lead-in to have Ekram speak to you about the IAIS principles. And from my perspective, now representing the NAIC, I want to articulate what we do in the United States, how we implement the requirements of ICP 8. Many of you know I was the director of the state of Arizona, the commissioner, for almost 9 years. And since I left that post a few years ago, I had the good fortune to work for the IMF, and I've done 2 FSAPs, one in Bahamas and one in Italy. And so it was a very, very difficult exercise, but you go through the process in a similar way, doing the FSAP, in evaluating how a jurisdiction, how the supervisor implements these ICPs in their jurisdiction, but then you're also looking at how they address it, how the companies are implementing it. So I found it an interesting parallel. While you're doing an FSAP, you're evaluating the supervisor himself or herself in the way that they look at the ICPs, but then you're also looking the next level in how well are the companies in compliance. So it gave me a different and interesting perspective that I'll share with you a little bit in the presentation today. So what I've listed here on the first slide is the elements that contribute to ICP 8. There's 6 elements for effective internal controls. And I guess the key idea, everybody's familiar with these terms, but the key idea for compliance with ICP 8 is to recognize the codependency between each of these elements. It's fine to have an excellent control function, for example, but if you're missing a step, say, for example, you outsource your claims handling processes, the company does. Well, maybe you have very good cybersecurity, but your outsourced entity maybe isn't as good. Cybersecurity is a very hot issue right now. And so what I wanted to illustrate is how they're all interrelated and they're codependent. So when the supervisor is reviewing a company's internal controls and all of these interrelated functions, you not only look at the function itself, but you look at the codependency, because a failure of one piece might just crash the whole system. So that's the key thing, is watching and how each one intermeshes, if you will, with the other. So how do we do that in the United States? We rely on our famous, notorious examinations, risks-focused examinations, on-site examinations of the insurers. Just how well do they comply with these functions? The key focus is how they do it, not once every 5 years, certainly, but we increase the frequency. If something comes up and we see that there might be a problem, the authorities, you do have the authority to go in as necessary. And sometimes only go back in on a specific scope examination. If there's a particular area that may be deficient or you may be concerned about a problem, you may instigate an exam on just one issue as opposed to a broad-focused, full-scope exam. So what do we look at when we go in? The key focus is the control processes of the companies. How do they limit their current exposures and risks? What are they doing to look prospectively? What's coming at them down the road? How well are they prepared for that? What controls do they have in place to react and respond and be proactive about any situation? Corporate governance, enterprise risk management, big deal. Very, very important. At a functional level, how well does the board operate? How well does the senior management operate? Are there interactions? So you really want to get, as an examiner, an understanding of how this company controls its risks. And you look at the risks, they explain their processes, and it's an investigation, really, by the examiner of the specific risks applicable to that company. And what they do in the report after the exam is a follow-up with the companies. Explain what deficiencies they may have found. There's a public examination report, so there's a lot of transparency in the result once the exam is completed. There are ongoing considerations. My department, when I was the Arizona commissioner, you do follow-ups. We may have done an exam of this particular company 3-5 years ago, But if there's still issues related to a particular aspect of corporate governance, well, then we'll do periodic follow-ups. And it's constant communication with the management of the company. So this slide here just gives you, in the US, the entire process for a risk-focused examination. And there's 7 phases there, as you can all see. But the ones that I really want to focus on, which relate primarily to ICP 8 compliance, are the first 3. It's understanding the company, the specifics of that particular company, identify and assess their inherent risks and their activities, and then their controls. What kind of risk mitigation are they doing? What processes and procedures do they have to address the particular risks that they face? So we'll go through these 3 steps, but this slide just gives you the idea of the full phase examination and the ultimate report of examination that becomes public at the end of the process. Okay, so on phase 1, that's the key part of understanding the company. The examiners go into the company, and their first efforts are to assess and document and identify what the risks they are, and what risks do they have, how do they relate to those risks. They assess the overall functions of the company, what kind of oversight do they have interdepartmentally. They document the assessment and the evaluation, and they look at their governance structure. And what we mean by that is internal controls, risk management, their compliance function, and their actuarial function. Now, the NAIC has put together a lot of materials to provide guidance to the examiners, and we have an examination handbook that guides the department's representatives, examiners, to assess these various aspects. And these assessment tools are available in a handbook to the examiners. A lot of them very experienced. They've done this many, many times. They know the questions to ask. They know what to look for. So they get an assessment going. They try to understand how best this company operates. And they look at the adequacy of their oversight and their controls. And the idea is to just get a good sense of how well they perform. So it's looking at prospective risks and how well they perform to address them. Now, coming up on the horizon, as you're all familiar with, the ORSA requirements, which go hand in hand with internal control and risk management. And that's going to be a new tool for regulators. Granted, it applies to the larger companies and the larger groups, but more and more we are seeing more companies interested in what this ORSA tool is and what the requirements are. Available on the NAIC website is the guidance manual that I was a part of in developing when I worked as the Arizona Commissioner as part of our Solvency Modernization Initiative. So the ORSA manual, you might take a few moments to go on the NAIC website and take a look at it. It really sets out what these new requirements starting next year are going to be for the ORSA. And basically it's three parts to the ORSA report that's going to be required of these large entities. It's them to describing their internal controls and their risk management. It's going to be providing stress testing under normal and stress conditions. They've got to show results and how they've evaluated that. And then finally, it's a prospective solvency. There's this prospective solvency piece to the ORSA report. So it'll give the regulators a better tool to look inside of how the companies are managing their own risks. Now, again, the requirement is only for large groups and large insurers, but I think it's a valuable tool for not only regulators, but also other smaller entities. So back to the exam process. I mentioned the first phase being understanding the company. Second phase is identifying and assessing the risks for each of the company's activities. And so the key question in any assessment like that, okay, what happens? What can go wrong? Something bad may happen, and whether it be in a capital side or whether it be an operational risk, the idea is to ask the question. You're the examiner, you go into the company, what is possible that could impact the company in its various stages of business? And see, this lists critical risk categories. So the examiner is going to look at each of these individual areas and question the company as to, well, how did those activities, what could go wrong with this particular activity? What do you people have in place to react and respond and mitigate the effects of that. So it's like a checklist, really, when the examiners are in there asking these questions and trying to get a response from the companies and evaluate. And you look at the documents, you look at the policies and procedures, and what do they have in place to mitigate any kind of risk that they may run into. So then the third phase of the exam process, once you've understood how the company works and you identified and you're assessing the risks of each company's activities, then the third phase is to put your finger on what controls do the company have in place. I mean, it's very, very important. Not only are there processes in procedures, but it's also how do they double check? How do they cross check? Who's looking over the shoulder of the person that's responsible for such and such of an activity? And so cross-checking and identifying the risks and what controls they have in place. So what the examiner is going to do, they create a document, what's called a risk matrix, and they'll put in there the various areas being examined, what the controls are, and evaluate how the risk mitigation matches to what the risks are. And then we ask the companies to obviously document their findings. Are the controls appropriate for the risks? Are they effective? How do you find that out? Well, you try to do some testing with the company during the exam process. You'll have a sample testing. You'll create a situation, and they'll have to respond to show how they would respond to a particular risk and document it. And then that allows the examiner to evaluate the strength of those controls. Are they weak? Are they moderate? Are they really strong in a certain area? So it's sort of a check and balance of what they're doing to evaluate their own risks and how effective they are. I mean, I've not had a situation, the companies are always going to tell you that they're really super effective, they've got the controls in place and everything's great. But you go through some testing processes, and that's the purpose of the examination, to do the follow-up and see that it's really the case. So this evaluation, this U.S. exam process, is how they actually use it. Are they consistent? Are the companies consistent in their use? And you know, I mentioned I had the good fortune, in some days it didn't feel like such a good fortune of doing the FSAPs, but because it's a lot of work to it. But we kind of applied the same principles in evaluating the supervisors, in how well going through an example of their checks of a company was even more oversight. And we used the same kind of tools in evaluation. We gave them a test case. We followed policies and procedures that they did, but then we wanted to run through an example during an FSAP on how well the supervisor followed up with certain evaluations of a particular company. So kind of, it's out there in both levels. It's really a critical review, not only of the supervisor, but by the supervisor. So it's the checks and balances, and it's how does the company have in place that secondary level of review? Is it a haphazard kind of thing, the spot checking? Is it inconsistent or random, or do they really have a system in place to follow through and make sure that policies and procedures are being followed? Because it's one thing to have a process. Say you've got somebody that in a property and casualty company that has the job of entering in the claim log, maintaining a ministerial task, mind you. But what about follow-up? Is there a claim lost in that log? Is there some method or process to follow up on the accuracy of what this person is doing in their job? And that's, it gets to as Ekram talked about, the responsibility of boards of directors, of senior management, of key personnel, the communication levels between all of those entities at the company level. So it's just looking for levels of checks and balances and reviews. Very important. So this slide just sort of gives a visual of the examination methodology that we use in the U.S. And it allows the examiner, I think, to reach some independent conclusions on how effective the ongoing activities of this company is. So you look at their internal controls. Is it appropriate? Are they designed to a specific risk? I think the three in the middle of the slide here, control testing for sure. You walk through the process. They tell you what the process is, and then you, as the examiner, you try to do a process. You give them a model, a test, and you walk through the whole process and see how well they do it. Corroborative inquiry. Many examiners will go to a third party, maybe if there's a TPA involved or some other entity, depending on whatever the risk is, and so you'll get outside confirmation of what the company's telling you. So the examiner does that as well. And then controls testings and observations. Again, the regulator and an on-site, it's really key, the on-site exam. You're in the shop, you're looking at how they do their processes, and you follow through with how they go forward with, from the mailroom all the way up to the board of directors, and to see how those policy and procedures are put in place. And sometimes they'll ask for, like I say, a sample situation and follow it through the process to re-perform the activities that they supposedly do on a regular basis. I know in one of the FSEPs that I worked on, we did that with one of the supervisors. We started with one document and one report, and we followed it all the way through the system, through their electronic systems and their follow-ups. And so I would suggest to you as the supervisor, it's that follow-up, particularly on these kind of internal controls issues. I saw a case where you had a company, an excess lines carrier dealing with other underlying carriers. One of the underlying carriers was not an admitted insurer and did not have a license and was not a qualified surplus lines insurer. But yet they were doing business with this outfit, thinking that it was. Where are the internal controls in place to verify the legality of the companies that you're doing business with? If you're an excess lines carrier and the underlying carriers, are they lawful, are they a legal entity? So that's just an example of something that you want to look for and really follow up. Okay, well, how did you check out whether company A was licensed? Have you done business with them before? Did you check the domiciliary state? Those kinds of questions. So it's very, very important to ask the follow-up questions to see and you know, do they have a trail of proof or trail of evaluation on how they followed up on those rules? Who performed that review? How was it performed? So this kind of gives you a visual of the different tools that the regulators do use in exams in the U.S. So I guess the key point that I can leave with you is the effectiveness of this internal control system, because it just bleeds through the entire supervisory efforts, not only of the regulators, but of the boards of directors and the senior management. It's multiple interrelated elements. If you fail in one spot, it could really hit you hard on the other. And so it's a matter of evaluating as a supervisor how well that company is balancing their risks, responding and controls. I mean, there's resource issues. You know, you're going to have to reach a cost balance effectiveness. But with ICP 8, it's really something it really gives you a broad picture of how well that company is doing if you're asking the right questions and you're doing the right follow-up. And I can show you the IMF does that when they do the FSEPs as well. It's the same kind of process. So you just ask the questions, you anticipate, and you look to how they respond to the risks. So with that, I'll move on to questions once we finish our presentations. Thank you very much.